Welcome to our first lecture, and what I thought I'd do today is just give you a rundown of what history is, and in one respect I'm going to allow you to answer that. And I want to take you through some archaeological sites to discuss what archaeology can actually tell us, because we'll be looking at quite a few archaeological slides in this particular class. And what I have up on the screen is a list of questions plus a word called historiography. And what I thought I'd do is define that first and then ask you these questions. Now again, as I just said, I'm not going to be answering these for you. What I want you to do is to pick one of these questions, or pick two of them or three of them, and then go to our Facebook page and actually answer these. So starting off, historiography. So what historiography is the study of how historians wrote history. And you're probably wondering why that's important for our class. Well, it's really important because the way that history is written changes over time. So a really good example of this is gender, especially the inclusion of women into history. So if you look at books that are written like 50, 70, 100 years ago, there's not very much on women in there. And of course, women make up half the population and they're doing important things and so on. But men, who are primarily the historians, didn't really include women. Now, if you look at history books written from about 40 years ago up through the present day, women are prime targets for the topic of history. And that's because in the 1960s, you have the sexual revolution, women start going to college more, they're interested in their own history, so they start producing it. And of course, men write women's history as well. But that's what historiography is. So as we're going through the class, I want you to be thinking about how history is presented, how it's written down, how it's collected. And then what I have here is a series of questions. And again, what I want you to do is to pick a few of these, or even just one, and go to our Facebook page, type in your question, and then answer it as best that you can. So a couple things here. So what is history? So what I want you to think about is, time frames, or what it is exactly. Can what happened in the past be truly known? This is really important for us to think about, because our class is situated in the ancient world where there's not a lot of written sources, at least in the very beginning of the time period we'll be looking at, which is the Neolithic. So can we truly know what happened in the past? And another thing to add to that, if we can't, then how do we put all this together? Sort of a side question here that I put towards the top is, how is history recreated in books? So you'll be reading Dukier and Spielvogel's World History 1 book. How did they put that together? Like, what are the sources they used, and so on? Which leads into the next question. So what are the sources for history? How do historians, and how will you, put a history together about a specific topic? What exactly are they looking at? And then what do you do with those, which leads into the next question. Are these sources reliable? So you've got a few documents, say, from the early period of civilization. Do you trust those? Who's the author? So you have to start thinking about all of these things, because even though we might have documents and archaeology, what exactly can they tell us? And of course, that leads to, what are their limits? What's the limit of a document, and what's the limit of a piece of archaeology or an entire archaeological site? And then once you answer that, then you have to think about, what exactly are these telling us? So start thinking about that. Sometime during this very first week, go onto our Facebook page and attempt to answer one of these. Here is a jade axe, and I'm essentially just retelling a story that I've listened to on a podcast called History of the World in 100 Objects, and I'll have you listen to a few of those podcasts throughout this class. This is a stone axe that's dated to about 4000 BC. And it's an interesting story that's attached to this, and it's important to start off our class by thinking about what these objects can tell us. So you can see it's a beautiful axe made out of jade, and if you ask yourself, where do we tend to think about jade coming from, we usually think of Asia. And so when this jade axe was discovered, around dated to about 4000 BC, it was discovered in England. In specific, it was discovered in Canterbury in a grave. So what is a jade axe doing in England that's dated to about 6,000 years ago. So archaeologists, historians started working on this, and they did a bunch of chemical analysis testing on it and discovered that it didn't come from Asia. It actually came from Italy. And when they started to do more research on this particular axe, they actually discovered the mountain where this jade was actually mined from. And it turns out that it wasn't made in Italy. The chunk was taken from Italy. It looks like it was taken to somewhere in France and then developed into this stone axe. So someone in France took the chunk of jade, created an axe out of it, and then somehow it got to England and into this person's grave. Now, okay, that's the story. Now, what exactly can this stone axe tell us then? So there's lots of things it can tell us. First thing to think about is the photo on your right is a close-up of the edge. And what I want you to do is look at that edge and ask yourself if this axe has been used. So you can shut off the video, think about it. And what you tend to look for in terms of usage are chips. So if a stone axe had been used a lot, there are lots of chips off the edge. And as you can see from this, it's a clean edge. So that means it was never used. Now, why would someone have a jade axe that was never used? So one of the things that could be going on here is that this is some type of ceremonial object, or it was worth a lot of money, and then whoever it was buried with decided not to use it. Okay, so that's one thing that you can think about. This person was probably wealthy. So you can start thinking about government or the way that these people ruled themselves. Why is this one person having this extremely important object in his grave? Maybe he was the leader of these people. When he died, they buried these goods with him. You can also think about economy. So this is a jade axe found in England, manufactured in France, but ultimately coming from Italy. And we're talking about 6,000 years ago. So this is really into the Neolithic period when people are first starting to farm and domesticate animals. So you've got some type of economy here of trade because there wasn't a coin economy during this period. Of course, you can also think about art and the actual process of manufacturing this. So you've got someone who's digging it out of the side of a mountain, and then you've got someone actually creating this. So this one object, even though we have no writing attached to it, you can make a lot of good guesses by thinking about government, by thinking about economy and trade, and by thinking about art. Now what I want to do is talk about an archaeological site which is in modern day Syria today, and that is Dura-Europos. Now Dura-Europos, and you can see on the map, I've put a big arrow here where this is. It's right pretty close to the border of Iraq. It is a Roman fortress. And what was happening here is in the middle of the 200s, the Romans and the Persians, who are on the right side of this map, where it says Iraq, they were fighting bitterly over this particular area. So the Romans built a fort at Dura-Europos. And what you're looking at here is a drawing of the actual fort. And this is pretty typical for the place of building a fort. So if you look to your lower left, you see where it says Southern or South Ravine. If you look up at the top corner right, you see North Ravine. Bottom corner right, you see the Euphrates River. So this fortress is protected on three sides. You've got the North and South Ravine, and you've got the Euphrates River. So it was sort of vulnerable up at the top of the slide where it says necropolis, which is where the burial site is. So this is a fortress. The dark line you can see all the way around are the walls of the fortress. And if you look closely, there's these little squares within the wall. Those are towers. And these are all numbered. If you look closely, you can see some numbered. And then you've got the main gate. So that's the main place where you could enter into this easily. And of course, this is a perfect place for a fortress. So one thing to note here, you can look at the nice clean streets. They're all perpendicular and horizontal to each other. A lot of the buildings in here were surprisingly found to be temples. or religious sites. So it looks like within this fairly small area you've got about 20 different religions being practiced in here. Now what I want to do is just tell you a little bit about why this fort is important to history and why archaeology is important. So as I said, in the northern part, or sorry, in the upper part of the slide by the main gate and the main towers, that's where it's most vulnerable. And so the Romans knew that the Persians were going to attack. So they assumed that their wall would be strong enough, but they decided to strengthen it. And one thing they decided to do is to pile sand up onto the outside of the wall. The reason they were doing this is because the Persians would make tunnels under the wall, light a fire under the tower, and then this tower would collapse, which would of course drag down the wall, and you'd have your enemy within your fortress or within your city. So the Romans started piling up sand. Now what they ended up doing is deciding that wasn't going to be enough, so they piled sand over the top of the wall and within that first street. So if you look on the slide, you see buildings in here numbered. You can see 1, 3, 4, 5. Those were covered in sand. So they did that to protect the wall from collapsing in case the Persians did mine. And we know that the Persians did mine. We also know that the Romans dug counter mines. So they dug mines below the Persian mines. Anyway, the Persians attacked. Ultimately, they took the fort. And the Persians didn't really do very much with this, and the Romans abandoned it because they lost it. So over time, this place fills up with sand, and it's really lost in time until the 1920s, 1930s, when it was discovered. Now, when it was discovered, there were two things in here that really changed the way history is viewed, especially religious history. So what I want to talk about, first of all, is Building 3. So you see that first street, where we've got building 1, 3, and 4, 5 listed. I want to talk about buildings 3 and building 4. Now, building 3, I'll tell you right now, is the earliest church found during this period. Building 4 is a synagogue. And this building is building number 3. So this is the earliest Christian church. And you're probably wondering why that's totally important. Well, it's important because it's believed that from the very beginning of Christianity in the 1st century AD up through the 300s AD, Christianity was illegal. So it was assumed that Christians would have to hide out, practice their religion in private houses. And here you have a building that's fairly open to the rest of the fortress, and it's possible that Christians were practicing their religion in this particular building. And here you've got an archaeological drawing of the actual building. So this changed the way that history was written for early Christianity, because now people are starting to question whether Christians were actually persecuted as heavily as it was thought. Now, the archaeological site of Building 4. So what happened is when the archaeologists were uncovering all this material, all this sand that was piled up on top, they came across, as I said, a Christian church, which was Building 3, and right next to it, a Jewish synagogue. So that might not be all that surprising. Jewish people could essentially practice their religion openly, but what this did was this also changed history. And the reason for that is because of these. So I've put up one part of a wall painting that was found at Dura-Europos in the synagogue. And as you can see, it's a beautiful piece of artwork, and that's not the important thing. The important thing here is that it was thought that Jewish people would not paint faces because of this law, you shall not worship an idol. And so here you've got the painting, obviously with human faces. And what you're looking at here is the scene of Noah. Not Noah, I'm sorry. You've got the scene of Moses. And he is in his little reed basket being rescued by the Egyptian royal family. And this introduces that whole story to that. Okay. So we've looked at some archaeological things, and again, what I want you to do is, as we're looking at archaeology, to start thinking about what it can tell you. Think about government, think about economy, think about trade, think about art, and so on. Now, we also have writings from this early period when people start moving into civilization. And sometimes the object itself that was written on is a piece of archaeology. And here you've got 2 clay tablets, and these are written in a script called cuneiform. And cuneiform literally means wedge-shaped. So what you have, especially on the left, it's a better example here, you've got a clay tablet, and what they did was they wet the clay, they made lines, and it almost looks like modern day paper, then they took a stylus or something like a pencil and then pressed into the wet clay. And then they let it dry in the sun, and these were sometimes made to be reused. So it's wet, or it's clay, you let it dry, you wet it again, you get a nice smooth surface. These just happen to survive because of accidental fires. So you mix high heat and clay, you get the material being fixed. So a few things to think about. Definitely think about what archaeology can tell us. So go back through the video, take a look at those slides again, and I'm sure that you can probably think of more questions you can ask something. Also think about what the sources of history can tell us. So I just went through Dura-Europos, talked about how you've got some new material being discovered, and then this leads into the next bit that I want you to think about. So think about how history can be rewritten, especially after you've got new material found, like at Dura-Europos. You know, a simple question, you know, does it really change what happened? Or does it change our view of what happened? And if it changes our view, then how do you go about rewriting history? How do you include all of this new material? And again, think back to those questions at the very beginning. You've got new material. What exactly can it tell us?